In a moment, I'll ask everyone to turn their cameras on, so we'll have a discussion. But first, I just want to describe a little bit about what this session is about. So we hope that the closing session will be an opportunity for panelists, as well as the audience, to engage in a more free-flowing discussion about all of the concepts, both explicit and implicit, that have been so wonderfully presented over the past few days. As Felicia and Marah have so beautifully and incisively evoked at the beginning of the conference, so many of the presentations considered problems of time and temporality, which I've been all too aware of as we've been cutting off the discussion at the end of each session. So I'm hopeful that we'll find a way to use this last hour together and inhabit that time. So I'm going to hand it over to Kristen, who will pose a first question. And our hope is also that you'll bring all your own questions and comments to the table as the session unfolds. So now I'm going to ask all the panelists to, from all of the different sessions, to turn on their cameras and join us here. And audience members can use the Q&A function to chime in, and panelists can indicate your desire to speak via the chat function if you want to message Nick. So Kristen, take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeff. And thanks again to all of our panelists who have so generously shared their time and their thinking over these last 3 days. So this first question is addressed to everyone, so that panelists, audience, and attendees and moderators. And I admit it might strike as kind of deceptively simple, but it aims to draw out some complex connections. So plainly, the question is, how would you repair any of the concepts you encountered over the course of the conference? And, you know, just as a little context, our role as conference organizers, among much else, was to try to anticipate some of the productive resonances and even the productive dissonance between the concepts that folks shared in their abstracts. So now with the kind of fuller exposition of these ideas in our rear view, the hope is that we can think together about how the resonances and dissonances have played out. So what do y'all think? How would you repair not repair, but how would you repair any of the concepts you encountered over the course of the conference? Yeah, and as Jeff said, feel free to message Nick, and audience members can engage through the Q&A. I feel like maybe an extension of the question too is like, we could start at what panels kind of amazingly resonated. Because I'm thinking about this last one with Eddie and Harper really speaking explicitly to systems thought. And I think we anticipated some of those connections being drawn out, but I don't think we could have anticipated just how you know, productively you all kind of were working and thinking through such resonant lines of thought.
I'm going to go ahead and jump in. I was like, should I wait politely for longer? I was really struck by the resonance, just speaking for myself, the resonance between what I presented on astrology and retrograde thinking on the first day and Tyler's presentation this morning, and questions of longitude, latitude, and César's like desire not to be mapped. And some of the problems that I've been thinking through is like, okay, like if there is this astrological desire, or like this desire of the subject to become knowable, like what does the resistance to that look like, and what is that knowability? So when you have this poem where it's like, I don't want to have my latitude, I don't want to have my longitude, I don't want to have my place on the map, and I refuse this kind of God's eye view. For me, I was like, that's kind of, I mean, it's a different line of thinking, but I was like, that's the kind of resistance that I'm interested in as well. Like, what does it mean to say, like, you know, go against this idea of the astrological subject who says like, I am this moment in time when I was born, as Hanny Nicholas, who's a famous contemporary astrologer, has it, between that and saying like, no, I do not want that at all. I want the opposite thing, where even as I identify with this place, I still refuse a kind of mapping onto that place. So I was writing stuff down. I was like, okay, I see this. I get this. So that was very great for me to think about that and think about what would have happened if we were in a panel together. So yeah.
What do you think about that, Tyler? I wonder if you maybe were feeling some of those similar resonances as well.
Unfortunately, I was apartment hunting the first day, but just hearing it articulated, this overlap right now, I don't know. I mean, I was likewise thinking, like I said, this morning and yesterday, like, what would that look like to map that sort of disruptive engagement with the self and community within multiple systems of representation. And I think the difficulty of visualizing it or conceiving it is the fact that it is across, like I'm thinking across multiple discursive regimes, multiple disciplines, and again, multiple modes of representation. And just to speak to the temporal, I will say engaging that refusal was parallel to sort of challenging what it means to read Césaire and what it means to read this poem. I mean, you have genetic readings by A. James Arnold, who like sort of challenges. I mean, a lot of people think of this poem as a singular poem written in 1939, but again, as he points out, the edition we read is the 1956 edition that had undergone various significant changes. I think to say that we should go back, as he does, to the 39 edition, I'm not for that. I mean, if Césaire published this one last, but that's a whole other debate. But it is interesting to think in a genetic way to unsettle the Césaire that was writing that poem and to unsettle the subjective, I guess, evolution that's going on there, the different historical contexts in which he writes it. On that dawn that's burgeoning and that other dawn in Europe in 1939 versus 56, approaching more of a decolonial moment, and his relationship to communism. It's interesting to just sort of abstract in that way. And I guess this kind of deviates from this. I was just thinking this as you were speaking, Rose, how and as everyone was kind of going into the temporal, how I guess this works across different temporalities as well. What I was thinking about and my reading of Césaire's challenge to that aerial perspective. Yeah.
Maybe I can say something about this really quickly, which is that someone on the political concepts board was really psychic in pairing me with Suraj, because nothing in my weird abstract about Noah's Ark really like made it obvious that I was going to be an auspicious match for the concept of progress. But I think it really worked out really well in ways I never expected. I remember listening, preparing for my own talk, but hearing Benjamin come up and be like, hey, but not even just Benjamin generally, but specifically Benjamin on temporality, the ways in which dilation and the kind of atemporality of the frozen collection are both being, I think, by various thinkers used as an alternative to a certain just like progressive kind of Whiggish narrative of history, was really just like a wonderful and happy serendipity. I can imagine a version of my own talk that would have been slightly different, or that would have emphasized different aspects if I had been paired against Scott's talk in particular, not just because they're both weird topics, as sort of theological as they are political at least, but because I think that it would have encouraged me to emphasize some things that were sort of minor threads in my own talk. One of which is, I think, the kind of odd queerness of the collector figure as this sort of impotent final heir who's just dealing with the things of the past and is kind of cut off from the future in a particular way. But I think would have also let me expand a bit more, or I would have encouraged me to expand a bit more on the concept of a sacrifice, right? Which is, I think, a thread for both of us, like less prominently for me, but one I'm interested in, because for anthropologists, and funnily enough, this is part of my abstract that I ended up cutting entirely from the actual talk, but the anthropologist, Krzysztof Pomian, Polish anthropologist, he writes an entire book about collecting that starts off with the idea of the ritual sacrifice, not of like a person or living thing, but of objects, and the ways in which in temples of the ancient world, particularly in Greece, right, once an object was offered to the gods, right, it had to stay there. You couldn't re-enter it into the market. You couldn't use the vase dedicated to Mars as a vase again, right? It had to be a thing from that point on. It had to really be just a material object in a certain way. To such an extent that, right, archaeologists looking at these kind of temples find huge piles of smashed vases. And at first, it was like, what happened? Did they lose a battle and everything was smashed here? And the increasing conclusion was like, basically, no. When they ran out of space, they just had to smash it because they couldn't use it again. They couldn't sell it on. That would be the blasphemy, not destroying it, but leaving its physical remains there. And so even though that's thinking about sacrifice in a very different way than Scott is, I think at least that would have been one generative link for me to try to talk about more and emphasize what's going on with this bundle of ideas involves sacrifice, completeness, porousness, integrity, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, Eddie, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I wanted to comment on something you mentioned in this, Christopher, which is the keeping of the vases, or like yeah. So this reminds me of the part in Hamlet that like Lacan makes a big deal out of, for example, where Hamlet like freaks out because the food that was left over from his father's funeral is being like reused for the wedding of his mother and his uncle. So there's something here about exchange value that's entirely prescient with like the idea of mourning as being what is excluded here, maybe exclusion of exclusion again per Harper's earlier point. So like something about this symbolic dimension is very interesting in its political valence, because in a way it's a sort of inaction. Curious if anybody has any further thoughts on that, but I found that provoking.
Thanks so much. If I can just say, I wrote about that scene in Hamlet along a lot of these similar lines. And I think about that absolutely like the most disgusting sentence Shakespeare ever wrote all the time. The funeral baked meats did coldly furnish forth the marriage tables.
That's the one. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, I'd love to see what you've written on it.
Can I throw one I would have liked to? I think it would have been fascinating to hear structural adjustment with swarming, because there is a kind of holism operating in the Afro-pessimistic, like to end the world, capital W. So I'd be interested in the movement of structural adjustment against the movement of swarming. And then from the comment, Africanized bees from Sexton, I think those two would have been, and then both are thinking through conditions of warfare, I would say. Well, obviously George Jackson is thinking through conditions of warfare. So yeah, swarming and what that critique of the world might look like. Or what the question of the world might pose back to swarming or to the swarm. The Afro-pessimist world is one that I'm thinking about. And then another, just from a brief little moment in Tyler's presentation, when you said you were kind of speculating about what Césaire would have seen. I just love when like thinkers do, like writers, artists, thinkers do that. It's like a thing I love. So I'm thinking co-presence and elliptical ontology, just from that moment when you were speculating about, okay, it's most likely he was at the bibliothèque, blah, blah, blah. There was something there that was powerful, and the directions you're trying to go with mapping and, I don't know, imaginative. And I wonder how co-presence could be thought into that. But that was just from like a moment.
I'll just say I unfortunately had to teach during Justin's panel, so I didn't get to see structural adjustment, and I'm really sorry. I'm gonna watch the recording because it's structure. It's a concept I'm very intrigued by. One, I thank you, Felicia, for that suggest. That's like an extremely generative kind of connection to make between Afro-pessimism and holism that I had not thought of. Something I've been trying to do some like historical work on lately is at some point in the 70s, the year is escaping me, there was like a sort of like, not conflict or not clash, but this sort of moment of tension between these kind of like cybernetic hippies and the Black Panthers in San Francisco. And at some point, the editors of one of this journal called Coevolution Quarterly, which was a spin-off of this thing called the Whole Earth Catalog, which was this like, cybernetic hippie like journal where it was like, we go back to the land movement, this like really kind of bad, like racially segregated commune movement thing. Anyways, they invited some of like the local leaders of the Black Panther Party in San Francisco to edit an issue of this journal. And there was a kind of fight between the concept of system in whole earth system and totality as the Black Panthers were articulating it. And I don't know all that much about it, but I'm interested in the kind of disjunction there and the way that a concept of like system and totality as articulated by the Black Panther Party does not line up with the kind of systemic worldview that these kind of cybernetic hippies were interested in. But I think, thinking about Afro-pessimism as a kind of maybe a different kind of holism is a really useful line of thought. And I'm gonna be thinking about that for a while. So thank you.
I shared in the chat just the link to our conference schedule, so folks don't have to try to do the work of remembering all the concepts they saw. We can kind of refer back, so take a look.
I guess one thing that jumps out for me, and it would be less of a pairing and more of like an octagon, but just something that came up again and again over these days is just kind of the ways that we try to orient ourselves conceptually and in space and all of this, and the ways that kind of all of them are vulnerable in different ways or can fail us in different ways, whether it's, cartography and mapping or narratives of progress. I think that like all of you guys have invited me in different ways to think more about the ways that any sort of system or approach or heuristic can help, and it can also like sort of have its own downsides and be misleading. So just overall really appreciated the way that you guys brought that out in different ways.
One of the pairings that kept coming to mind, or one of the potential pairings that came to mind during the Salah presentation was also structural adjustment for me, especially afterwards when Felicia asked or sort of nodded to the psychic demand of asking people to stay unadjusted. I think that's how you phrased it. And so thinking about communization as the like sort of as a gradual and incremental positive practice of meeting material conditions, meeting how that relates to then Salah as a protective sort of impulse towards the body, the home, the domestic space, but also a form of worship. I found those to be potentially an interesting conversation.
Please go ahead, Julia. Feel free to just speak.
Sorry, that was a bit of a slip. I meant to press another button. By the moment the conference ends, I'll have mastered. We also have a question that I wanted to offer up from Professor Adeofir from the Q&A. So I'll just read that out now, but I think all the panelists should be able to see it too. So Professor Ophir says, I would like to invite the presenters to reflect on their experience organizing their thoughts and writing around a single concept. Was the concept you chose to work on a guide or an obstacle, an enemy or a friend? Have you tried to ward off other intruding concepts that tried to work their way into your text? Can you say something about your more or less intimate relationship to your concept, love or hate, frustration, excitement, etc.? And I guess the only thing I would add to that is that I would just be especially interested to hear all of you reflect on that, because I know there were actually some changes to concepts from the moment they were initially proposed to the last few days. So with that, I'll turn over the floor.
So I can answer maybe in 2 steps. Our concept was original technicity. And I feel like if it's a concept that you are not really conceptualizing for the first time, most of the concepts have their origins of emergence, and they have a kind of histories in certain discussions. And then there's always a challenge to how much you are reiterating that discussion with that concept, or you are adding new elements and bringing into a new time. And I think one of the fun part of discussing original technicity was exactly that, because the question of technology comes back at different times in history, and every time it is limited by whatever technology available at that time. So Heidegger was, for example, speaking about radio or instantaneous transmission, or Nietzsche was maybe talking about typewriter, and maybe people in 80s were still talking about television to some extent. And their discussion about how technology is originary or is kind of can be utilized against essentialist notions of subjectivity were limited by that historical point. So it was fun for us to kind of add ourselves to a tradition of discussion of the concept, while at the same time speaking about new artwork, algorithms, new discussions. So it was kind of fun trying to balance those, because the concept goes all the way back to Plato and his discussion of what happens in writing. Is it still conversation, or it's not? Or something else, because the writing cannot answer you back. So the philosophy loses this intersubjective element, and that's the risk Socrates sees in technology, that it's deadening. Then Derrida says, by the way, every speech relies on some kind of materiality. That constitutive debate haunts us, but at the same time, I think even the way you perform the concept changes with the new environment. So for our case, if we thought like, let's serialize, let's inundate with examples to kind of perform that originary situatedness of subjectivity. So yeah, it was a challenge, but also quite fun to engage a kind of a classical concept. So thanks for the opportunity a lot, actually. Yeah, we wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't, I think, a concept. It's like the conference gives an opportunity for crystallization, which is amazing.
I'd love to respond to that question. I think it's a really good question. Because yeah, I definitely was one of the ones who submitted a concept last year, and that was my first year in my PhD program. Spent this last year kind of going in a slightly different direction, and so it kind of helped me arrive at a very different concept. Which after presenting, I realized the ways that the concept I originally had presented was also related. But I think for me, it's interesting because I was thinking about like, okay, how do I arrive at adjustment? And I think I kind of, I think George Jackson has been my person for this year. Like each year I've kind of had like my one person who has kind of can't get out of my head, and he's been the one for this year. And I feel like he'll probably be someone I won't be able to get out of my head for a very long time. But as he kind of like first had me think about adjustment just by itself, just because he was using the language as a lot of his writings in his prison letters, especially to his family, is kind of frustrating. He's kind of expressing frustration at them because he's just saying like, you are adjusting yourself to make yourselves work within the structure, when you're adjusting yourself away from admitting who the enemy is because you don't want to fight them. And so I kind of had that in the back of my head as I entered, like, reading about Root and Wilderson for the first time this semester, or the first time more closely. And I think the reason I chose structural adjustments because it stood out because I was already thinking about adjustment by itself. And I think as I was trying to point out in the talk, I think there's just ways that there's the ways as debates around Afro-pessimism that some of it I'm not interested in, and some of it I think is away from the point. And I was trying to say, okay, what is the actual point? And honestly, even if like maybe Afro-pessimism itself isn't necessarily as clear about that point, for me, I'm like, this is the point for me. And it's like, how do we think about revolution? And I'm also just one of those people that, especially where, I don't know, I see like people, I'm not necessarily interested in a thought camp. Like, I don't see myself as an Afro-pessimist. I don't see myself as any ist. I'm just like, what is interesting to me? And I think there's ways that I see, for example, the Pan-African traditions who see Afro-pessimism as like, I would never think with that. What are you talking about? And I think structural adjustment is a way, and I think Debbie like helped me say more clearly what I was trying to say, of like the term as a way of like, it, again, like if we think Wilderson as one specific person, like of course one thinker is limited, but like how do we think about the little drops that he leaves, or to think about it more fully? So basically I'm saying like that term can also say like, okay, what are the levels that maybe Afro-pessimism and Pan-Africanism could be better in conversation? And thinking both, and what I was trying to say is thinking both like about desire and also about like literal structure and literal material economic formations, because both of his levels of violence to like prevent folks from like achieving a type of movement or a type of organization. So I thought that term, and I feel like there's definitely, even the way that I approach it, there's definitely more development on how those linkages that are possible. So yeah, so that's something that I guess what I wanted to clarify a bit more. So.
I'll just jump in quickly and say something about my experience with my concept, which I think probably other people have experienced as well, because I did, if anyone who didn't see it, I did retrograde, which is like, how can we account for or talk about modern astrology critically from an academic perspective. And the whole time, like, I have this relationship with my object where I'm like, assume antagonism from people, and that's why I have to set it up a lot and say like, listen, like I understand like this antagonism, but we need to reorient ourselves, which I think, like, from what I'm hearing everyone else saying, that's an experience that all of us have had, to say like, okay, I have an interpretive relation to my object or to my concept, what I'm trying to talk about. What I'm thinking when I was writing, I was like, I feel like I'm having a method war with myself, just like by myself, trying to work out how to approach an object that is always about reorientation, which is fun if you like that kind of thing, but also like incredibly difficult and stressful. So that's been my experience with my object over the past year for this, but then like couple of years for the research, which probably speaks to other people as well.
I think, Rose, what you just said about the method war, I quite like that phrase, because it's actually, I think, a really neat way of summing up the feeling when it comes to the concept, at least for myself as well. Also, just it was something that has come up repeatedly for me, and just now in Marah's question or comment about posing, Sarah and structural adjustment together, as it came up as a repeated theme for me when engaging with writing specifically for an audience in which one can actually presume a certain degree of political investment and involvement, and in a particular direction as well. I think one of the toughest things for me was actually dealing with the thinkers who had thought with Marx in about the sorts of cases and historical moments in which I was trying to write about, because it's precisely that sort of difference between, I think, as Marah said, the material conditions versus the, I suppose, the more metaphysical or religious dimensions, or at least intangible religious dimensions that have to be accounted for when it comes to the sorts of movements and moments that I think not just myself, but a lot of people are interested in. That was something that I continuously struggled with, because it felt like a lot of the time thinking with Marx in the way that the historiographical tradition had done so, specifically when it came to Muslim societies, was actually doing violence by either just abnegating completely the religious dimension of struggle, or not considering it as a place in which one could formulate or advance political thought, and trying to retain, I suppose, some of the original impulses. I think, and now original is a word that I'm very sketchy about after Sandra and Talha's presentation, but at least trying to retain some of the early thoughts and impulses when it came to approaching these materials from a particular political standpoint, without committing myself to the same sorts of damages that were being done to the historical subjects, and trying to not think myself within, I think, a main tradition of leftist thought. And that was a real challenge, and I don't think I've resolved it by any means, but this conference has actually been extremely useful in seeing other people, I think, work out very, very well fleshed out and nuanced approaches from a similar political angle, but without necessarily assuming the same degrees of, I think, hard materialist commitment that can sometimes unconsciously do damage, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I want to say that both Julia and Adi's questions, and then kind of everything Justin said and folks are kind of discussing now, anticipates a lot of the questions and thinking that I wanted to provoke from you all. So, well done or whatever. But I'm also really interested in the long incubation period of these concepts, unintentionally, because we started organizing January 2020 when we all saw each other in person, and various delays were required because we were trying to figure out what the format of this conference would look like. And in that time, most of you actually retained the concepts that you proposed. And I think what you said, Justin, speaks really thoughtfully to how just agile and flexible thought work is and can be, and kind of what Talia was saying earlier about just thinking originarily about what the context of emergence that certain concepts have, and how Eddie was drawing our attention to the kind of inherent contrivance of machines. We could think about concepts similarly. And so I'm just curious, echoing again Adi's question about how the 18 months of being with this concept and committing to seeing it through felt for the folks who kept their originally proposed concepts.
Maybe I can say something about that really quickly, which is that it's funny to look back on an abstract written in what feels like a totally different world, but there are lots of promptings in the past year to think about, for me, hoarding in addition to collecting. And there was this kind of, there was a tension for me where I found that my own writing about collecting was moving constantly into hoarding instead, right? The Collier brothers, who I discussed, are more properly hoarders than they are collectors. They weren't doing a systematic antiquarian kind of thing. But I guess that in a way I felt that this was okay because, and this is a sort of truism for writing about collecting, right? But collecting is always oriented towards hoarding instead in a certain way. Something begins as a collection and turns into a hoard. If you look at these sort of collectors or hoarders memoirs, they almost always have a very similar pattern, right? You collect old comic books, but sometimes old comic books would come with an action figure or a toy or a poster. So now you're collecting posters and action figures and toys and mugs and Pez dispensers and the old-timey display cases that comic books were shown on. To be clear, this is very autobiographical because I collect old comic books, but there's this kind of pattern. And so I found myself sort of moving in a lot of ways really into that latter category, but ultimately kind of finding that there was a reasonable harmony to that development.
I can try to speak to this question a little bit, and then also maybe a question that was brought up in the Q&A. I likewise, it's been a strange, relatable experience, and just, yeah, looking back at this concept that just kind of came up in my MA essay. And I used it elsewhere in a couple of spots. And so it's kind of been, it's fluid and sometimes threatening to become overhauled. But it was helpful. I sent that essay, my MA essay, into a journal, and their comments were super helpful, and just like they're like, this concept you brought up, and I was like, great, this is an opportunity to work on this paper as well as this conference and really rethink it. But yeah, it was, I guess I'm struck by this sort of effective experience of returning to these concepts that we've had to all think through. And I guess this speaks to Felicia's question about what I might see with how I might rethink my project through the idea of co-presence, which likewise speaks to, I believe, Christopher's question about what was it? Black spaces and places that are otherwise to this sort of structure, to the I guess possessor figures perspective. And one thing I do want to just note, both that quote and this conception of the human as the midpoint between the indigenous and the Black, or I riff off of in Black shows. I just want to emphasize that. But I was thinking about co-presence in the context and as an impossible Black otherwise space in the archive. You can think of Saida Hartman's Wayward Lives, as well as her work in A Venus in Two Acts, that is likewise a co-presence with Foucault, and this sort of encounter with fleeting lives, or I guess this encounter with the archive, with these fleeting representations of fleeting lives and their encounter with power. But I'm also thinking of Brent Hayes Edwards' Taste of the Archive, and sort of these experiences. He's likewise in conversation with Foucault, but sort of the somatic experience of what is it about the archive that makes you keep returning? You see something, you feel something. Foucault describes it, I think, as like a scintillation, or I can't remember the word, but yeah, and it's just, I guess there is this co-presence in the archive, and thinking with, walking with, working with other scholars who I guess, instead of assuming the transparency of their position, include that in the conversation, and so make both themselves and others in that space, which I think has become more and more of a, I guess you would say, a Black otherwise space. Thinking, yeah, co-presence in the archive. I guess, yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking, in conjunction with a lot of what's been said. I don't know if that's entirely clear, but
perhaps I can take this opportunity to read Chris's excellent question in the Q&A, which Tyler referenced for those who may not be able to see the Q&A. So Chris writes, thank you to all the presenters and to the organizers and tech staff. Special shout out to Africana Studies people on here. So Chris writes, Tyler made reference to the quote, vantage point of the possessor, end quote, in terms of maps. I couldn't help but think about the possessor figure relative to the concepts of structural adjustment and collection. Whose structures, whose adjustments, and whose collections claim to possess certain spaces and places? What do you all think are some otherwise advantages or valences of Black spaces and places that trouble the possessor inclination of the colonial cartographic? It's a really good question. One thing I might venture has to do, I think, a bit with the kind of intersection between Justin's concept and Harper's that they were kind of discussing earlier. In that one way that Kant's concept of swarming or Schwärmerei has been understood is as a kind of fanaticism or enthusiasm that is seen as maybe dangerous to stability of a polity. And so I wonder if the kind of unadjusted politics is a way, and in this other way of figuring Schwärmerei or swarming from, with Samasa's comment about Africanized, about Sexton and Moten's use of swarming is a way of thinking about the possessor vantage point. Not so much speaking to the cartographic, but.
This does not answer your excellent points there at all. One thing, but just when you said the word fanaticism, I'm thinking it would almost be fun to pair swarming with collecting. Chris, I was really interested in your paper because of the kind of what I heard to be the kind of Lacanian resonance of it, right? Like, the kind of what's delightful about the objects is not anything about the objects themselves, right? It's something kind of in the object more than the object, right? And they're kind of removed from all like use value and exchange value. They become kind of valuable solely in and of themselves for the kind of like jouissance that they produce in the collector. And in that way, they kind of evince like they circulate in a sort of, diseconomy, or they kind of the economy of collecting that you're articulating, right, that is kind of, and I really liked what you said, this is all over the place. I really liked what you said in the Q&A about kind of investment as progressive economy. That really stuck with me as a way of distinguishing the kind of collecting that you're interested in from a collecting that, works towards like generational wealth and forms of accumulation. So I think that the way that you articulated collecting as something that works to the side of these other economies was really generative, and something that could actually be used to kind of contest the kind of system, like the understanding of like the kind of pairing of economy and system in the kind of literature that I'm dealing with.
Yeah, I like that a lot. We could have come under some sort of like cheesily subtitled, mini panel of like groupings, plural, something like that.
So I'm really trying to think about this question from Christopher, and I think maybe this kind of, I might try and like respond to it with a version of the other concept that I had put on the table last year. And so I was thinking about, I'll try to be very brief with it, but I was thinking about the idea of respite as a way of thinking about breathing space. So basically, like, if we think about anti-Blackness as something that has to be constantly responded to, what does it mean to like think about space, like both like a space, I guess, like in terms of mapping the geography, like what is a space someone can like maybe like retreat to, right? To like have space to like reconfigure politics, to experiment, those type of things. And so I think about specifically I'm thinking about like Kwame Ture, who literally is like, I'm gonna dip off, like I needed to retreat. I'm going to Africa, study with Kwame Nkrumah, and I'm coming back. And he's like, the importance of taking a step back to study. And then even like I don't know. And then I'm even thinking about like even George Jackson was talking about the period of revolutionary consciousness comes in the struggle for withdrawal. And so I guess it's like in the process of trying to situate oneself in relationship to the into I guess like structures of like anti-black like constraints on thought. Like I guess it's like how do you, I don't know, I guess like the idea of like how do you find space and time to I guess like practice something else, right? Or like to reorganize your investments, or to also be, and I think the Kwame Ture example is interesting because also thinking about like what is this kind of, I guess like in terms of like geography of thought of like literally he's like I'm leaving, I'm like leaving the South, like I'm in the trenches, I'm literally leaving, and like he comes back and he's like very much thinking about this kind of like this Pan-African process and also thinking about the questions of land. And so basically, which is basically a way of reorganizing these colonial maps at the level of like political strategy. So I don't know. I don't know if that answers, but that's something that I'm thinking about in response to the question. It was a way of me trying to think about how to connect my old former ideas to what I was putting to what I thought about, I guess, this week. So.
I think Tim's question here that he posted in chat is a good one and maybe another jumping off point. And it also ties things nicely together. So Tim Buse asks, I think my question is closely related to Audie's. In her introductory remarks on Thursday, Marah talked about concepts as masks, for example, labor, outside agitator, blue lives. In the past, it has often seemed to me that presenters at political concepts conferences have a hidden concept that their manifest concept is hiding. Can any of you identify a hidden concept that your manifest concept is hiding, and that more directly, but perhaps more embarrassingly, describes your real project? So I think Chris has, for example, talked a little bit about hoarding as maybe that secondary concept. And what, sorry, not to put you on the spot, Eddie, but one very interesting concept that kind of popped up at the end of your paper was stupidity, right? And there might be a heuristic there with stupidity. So yeah, I'm wondering both specifically with Eddie about stupidity and in general about these sort of secondary concepts lurking behind everybody's ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I like the question too for the Freudian reference and stuff, but I would just add that we should go one further step and refract the latent content back into the manifest content and ask, okay, so why did the repressed latent content appear behind that manifest form? So to try and answer the question now, system and stupidity. Yeah, because there's a certain tendency towards complexification and stuff that in systems theory that's like smarter and smarter aims towards a sort of like unassailable position of like absolute knowing. Not even absolute knowing, because in Hegel this is a moment of like sort of impotence actually, or like actually I don't know anything, or like the fundamental Socratic moment of philosophy. But if I had to give a reason why stupidity appears behind system, is because in a way, or why it appears in this form, is because I'm interested in this. It's nonetheless very basic in philosophy world, but I still feel a lot of attachment to it. The sort of Cartesian problematic of deception, and then the variant on it that Spinoza does. Because Spinoza tries to do this sort of advanced form, this of like, how stupid can Descartes be? He's like, oh yeah, how are you gonna solve this two substances thing? Oh, well, it's the pineal gland where God intervenes in this like little walnut thing or whatever. And Spinoza's like, Descartes is a smart guy, but it's only like 1600 something, whatever. And Spinoza's already like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard, whatever. But then Spinoza himself sort of in the guise of like sort of like theory-brained attempt at it, like proposes this sort of like, if you guys are familiar with the ethics of Spinoza in part 5, the subspecies eternitatis, from a certain perspective of eternity, which is sort of like a God's ideal or like a unassailable vantage point, to point to some of the stuff in the chat that's like outside of everything, which to me is like an even dumber version of the pineal gland by virtue of thinking it's not dumb. So, I mean, or thinking it's not dumb, whereas the pineal gland is a certain naivety of like not knowing. And I think for politics, this is like definitely a relevant factor, even like tactically, because like, you know, a lot of people talk about like how dumb do Trump people have to be to have voted for Trump and stuff like that. But it's like, how dumb do you have to be to lose to the dumb guy? This is, you know, another level of what had happened and stuff like that. So I find this aspect of stupidity interesting because in a way, stupidity is like kind of brilliant from another angle of like systems thought that has this and certainly Lacan is like all about this at a certain level. There's a certain weird obscure seminar where he's like sort of exalting like how great it would be to be like totally stupid. Anyway, yeah, I gave it a shot at trying to answer the question but maybe that's a test to something going on here.
I've been talking a lot, but I'm just going to jump on again. I'm interested in stupidity as well as a thing that like, everyone's like, astrology is stupid. I'm like, well, yeah, like kind of, but lots of things are stupid, right? But then that wouldn't be like my shadow concept, but I'm more interested in this like crisis. So like this version of political concepts kind of ended up being themed around crisis or crises, as many things have in the past year or so. But then when people talk about astrology, so often, like, and this happens like in like Victorian era, like 30s, 60s, sorry, 70s now, people's like, why do people believe in astrology? They're like, they're because there is a crisis. There's a crisis and people don't know what's going on. So they need to grab onto this thing because they are too stupid to work out other things, but it's governed by the crisis. And I'm very resistant to that approach. I think it's, you know, I think it's quite lazy just to say like, it's all about the crisis. Like, this is always crisis, it's all about the crisis. And this is something that is kind of like an ahistorical argument that you can make over and over again. So yeah, I think like the flip side, like maybe the crisis is a flip side of my concept, but then on the flip side of that flip side is also stupidity.
I would be curious to hear Taha answer the hidden or behind concept, if there is one.
I mean, we avow directly saying that we are doing deconstruction. If it's a concept, then not a method. But in my dissertation, I developed a concept of will to temporalize, kind of spinning on will to power, saying something like temporalization is an inevitable practice. And every time it happens with given technologies. And I try to keep something of subjective aim or kind of singularity by saying it's a will, without saying that, without making a distinction between organic and disorganic. So in our paper too, we wanted to give a sense of kind of this exercise of power in its kind of not extra ethical meaning, but it's more like really in this neutrality, how can we be specific about new types of exercise of power? And I think when we are discussing this, unresolvability of technicity in relation to subject, it's always a question of how power reinvents itself. What are the new technological capacities that allow power to transform? So lots of things from Nietzsche in the sense that, that creative moment has a lot of is related to power and feeling powerless or striving for power. So and every we know that all the deconstructive school of thought is reliant on Nietzsche and his kind of thinking on post-history. So those are the maybe more network of concepts and a network of discussions that grounds our paper. I don't know if there's a specific thing that kind of was screaming, do you think, in our talk that seemed like more latent dream desire, unconscious desire for some forbidden word or something? I don't know.
No, I was just thinking that there was maybe some tension in just the very concept or like method you were evoking with originary that made it difficult perhaps for you to identify another sort of latent concept within your concept. There's something about your concept that seemed resistant to even the question of, is there a hidden or a...
I see.
So thanks for answering.
Sure.
I know we're very nearly out of time, and I'm not sure I want to have the last word, so I'll try and get this out really quickly so someone can say something after me. But one thing I'm really interested, especially thinking about Christopher Roberts, this question about kind of vantage point and stupidity, is the way that, and I'm also thinking about, Felicia, your comments from the Q&A on the first panel about like the atomic bomb as a model of kind of like a vertical model of power, right? Where there's a kind of vantage from above that looks down, and that power kind of works and like along this axis, to think about how a kind of systems model thinks about power as like, or not power, but that kind of thinks about kind of intelligence as distributed, right? That doesn't actually rely on any kind of bird's eye view, but that these kind of like very pernicious social forms actually don't presume any kind of totalizing knowledge at all, right? Like many of the conceits of systems thinking are that like individual agents are necessarily dumb, right? It's about getting all of these dumb things to like produce smart results in turn, right? And so much of like, I didn't talk about Friedrich Hayek a lot, but I'm really interested in his work, right? He's like, there's no way we can know everything or really anything about the economy. And if you try and intervene, you're gonna fuck it up. It's doing its thing, you know, don't mess with it. And it's this kind of, it's like, I'm interested in how the conceit of ignorance can be mobilized in the service of like very pernicious projects, right? That there's a kind of a sense of ignorance actually underlays like a free market ideology and a variety of other like systems concepts. But okay, someone else say something so that's not the last thing on the recording.
Something.
Thank you, Tyler, for wrapping it up. Kristen, is there anything you'd like to add before we close out?
I was gonna say, now that it's over, I'll say it, and then we just won't talk about it. But I was gonna say that I think, Rose, you suggested that, you know, crisis was kind of this concept or background theme that kind of galvanized the conference. And I would say maybe another concept that was the banner concept for the conference was student. And, you know, I think we raised that at the opening. And I think it will be interesting to kind of just reflect on the way that this iteration of the Political Concepts Conference was designed by, convened by, and comprised of students. And I wondered if there was any sense at the end of like a perspective or a unified kind of, I guess, iteration of student as a concept that you all felt kind of came out of this gathering, or might be spoken to, or might just need to be jettisoned altogether. So that's maybe my closing idea. But yeah, I just appreciate the opportunity to have been a part of gathering this really tremendous thought space. So thank you, everyone. Yeah. Well,
thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
I'm sad to
Thank you.
I'm like, don't end. No.
Word.